Hey everybody, it's Grace here again. We are on lesson 9 today, and we're going to be covering arrays and matrices. So, without further ado, let's just get straight into it. Okay, so here, first of all, I have a quick refresher from what was last semester or the last 8 lessons. So, in the last 8 lessons, we have covered printing output, data types, reading input with a scanner, for loops, while loops, our operations, and conditional statements. So that pretty much sums up everything that we have learned so far, up to the first half of the class. So maybe take a minute yourself, look at what we've covered, make sure you're familiar with them before we begin. All right, so now let's actually begin talking about today's topic. So I'm going to pose a problem to you guys. So we can say that we have several integer values, like for example, just 1, 2, and 3. And then we want to store them somehow. Well, to do that, we have 3 variables. We know how many there are, so we can just create 3 separate variables. So num1 stores 1, num2 stores 2, num3 stores 3. But what if we have a lot more values? Say we have 10 values, which is still kind of manageable, or 50, okay, it's starting to increase. 100, which is like a lot. Then it isn't so practical to create all these variables to store these values. So we have way too many variables to store the values, and we want to ideally keep them maybe in one place. And there is a way to do that. So the solution is an array. So this is a Java object, and it's essentially a variable that holds a fixed number of values of a single type. So this helps us save a lot of time typing things out, and also it saves us a lot of space. Once again, you don't want like 100 lines creating new variables and holding values in them. With an array, you can just get this done in 1 or 2 lines. And so what an array is, it consists of n elements in a row, and each one has an index from 0 to n minus 1. So right below here, I have a diagram. So this is an empty array. Now, in this array, the length is 10. So our n is basically 10, and there are 10 elements in here. So you can count, there's like 10 blank squares to store an element each. And so the indices range from 0 all the way to n minus 1, which in this case is 9. So yeah, we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then each element has an index. And that's how we know which value we're referring to inside the array. Okay, so now we kind of know what an array is. Then let's talk about how to create an array. So this is what the syntax will look like. So first you want to indicate the data type. So this is the same as for any variable. It could be an array of integers, an array of doubles, booleans, or whatever. And then you're going to want a pair of double braces to show that this is an array of whatever this data type is. Then you're going to give the array an identifier or a name, just like you would with a variable, once again. Okay, and then when we initialize the array, we're going to use the new keyword, and then once again, use the same data type. And then once again, we have double brackets. And in these brackets, you're going to basically tell Java how many elements do you want in this array, or in other words, the length of it. So this is an array of n elements, once again. Now, one thing that might be helpful to know is that every type has a default value. So for an integer, that is 0. For a double, that is 0.0. For a boolean, it's false. For a character, it's the sequence of characters. It kind of looks like a string, but it's not. This is just the null character. And then string, the default is just null. So when you are creating an array and initializing it, every value is going to be set to whatever the default value of the type is. So for instance, if I had, I don't know, an array of Booleans, everything is going to be set to false. Or in this example, I have an array of strings called colors with size 5. Everything is set to null, as you can see, because this is the default type. And then these are my indices, ranging from 0 to 4. Okay, and then there is another method that we can use to create an array. Now, this is more helpful when you know maybe what values are going in the array, or your array has a small size. So how this works is, first, same thing, you're going to declare the array, so the type, a pair of brackets, and then the identifier. Now, the main difference is when you initialize it. So we still use the equal sign, the assignment operator. And now within curly braces, you're going to list out the elements inside this array separated by commas. So let's look at the array of strings called colors. The elements that are going to go in here are the strings red, orange, yellow, green, and blue. And so after we've declared and initialized the array of strings, it looks like this. So red is at index 0, orange is at index 1, yellow is at index 2, green is at index 3, and then blue is at index 4. Okay, then let's talk about how we assign values in an array. So when we want to assign values in an array, we first have to access each element from indices from 0 to n minus 1, and then we assign it a value just like we would with a variable. So you can kind of treat each element in an array as a separate variable of whatever the data type of that array is. So our syntax looks like this. So we call the identifier, and then we have a pair of double brackets. And in these brackets, you're going to give the index of the element that you want to access. Then you can just assign it a value, just like you would with any variable. So for instance, going back to my example array, say I want to access the element at index 2 in colors, then I'm going to assign it the string yellow. So yeah, as you can see here, everything else here is null. And then at index 2, I change it to yellow. It's very clearly different from the other elements. Okay, and then we already kind of discussed this, accessing elements in array. The syntax just looks like this, identifier, and then the index. One thing to be very careful about is that your index has to be from 0 to n minus 1, or you're going to get an array index out of bounds exception. So for example, if I want the element at index 3 in colors, this is going to give me the string green. However, if I want index 5, that's very clearly not in this array. So it's not valid, and what I would get is this array index out of bounds exception. So be super careful about that. All right. Finally, let's talk about iterating through arrays. So in an array, every element is indexed from 0 to n minus 1. We already know that. So then we can use a for loop to iterate from the position 0 to n minus 1, and then access every element in the corresponding position. So that may sound a little confusing, so let's kind of look at the code to get a better idea of what that means. So this is just with any random array. So we have our for loop, for int I equals 0, I less than array length, I plus plus. We're going to do something with the element at index I in the array. So for example, if I had my example array, I want to print out every single element in there, this is what it'll look like. For int I equals 0, I less than colors.length, I plus plus, I'm going to print that out. Okay, so now we've covered pretty much the basics of arrays. So let's program a little. And you know what? Let's use the example array that I had in the beginning. So let's go ahead and create it. All right, so let's start by creating the array and initializing its values. And so there are two methods we can do this. First method, let's just have everything at the default values. And since our array is a small enough size to work with, we can just access every single element and then assign it some string. So it would look like this. Okay, then let's go ahead and go through the array and print out every single string in it. So this for loop is going to iterate through every index from 0 to 4. And now we're going to access the element at index I and print it out on a new line. And we are done. So let's run this. Okay, as you can see, this is what my output looks like. First line red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and yeah, these are in the correct order. And then let's try the other method of initialization. So now I'm going to put my values inside a pair of curly braces. Okay, now if I run this, I would get the exact same thing. There we go. All right, nice. So we've covered the basics of arrays. Now let's practice a bit with them. So here, let's write a program that adds two arrays together and prints out the resulting array. So let me pose an example. For instance, let's say we have one array called A, and it's got these values. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then let's say we got the second array, B. It has these values, which are 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so now I want to add these two arrays together. And then what I would get in my result is 6, 8, 10, 12. And why is that? What I'm doing is just adding every pair of corresponding elements. So if I take a look at the indices, 0, 1, 2, 3, 6 is a result from adding the two elements in A and B that are index 0. And then 8 is a result of adding these two. 10 is a result of these. And 12 is a result of these. And I can call this other array C, or the sum. Let's call it sum. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Take a couple seconds to look over that really quickly and make sure you understand it before we start coding. All right, so hopefully you understand it now, and let's start coding. All right, so here, what we should start by doing is creating our two arrays. Now, let's start simple and just begin by initializing the values ourselves rather than reading them in as input. Let's add that on after we finish the simple way. So I'm going to create an array of integers called A, and I'll just give it a couple random values. Same thing with my new array B. Also, make sure that your arrays are the same dimensions. Okay, so I have my two arrays that I want to add. Now, let me create a new array to store their sum. And here, I don't know their values yet. That's what I want to calculate, and that's what I want to put into my sum array. So I'm just going to initialize it, set everything to the default value 0. Okay, so now basically what we're trying to do is go through indices 0 to 3 and then add the elements at index 0 and A and B together and at index 1 together and so on. So this calls for another for loop. Okay, so now we're iterating through every index, and we're just going to populate the sum array now. So the element at index I in sum is going to be equal to the sum of AI plus BI. And there we go, we're done. We've calculated the sum. Now, last part, we just want to print it out. So yet another for loop. Okay, that's good. So let's run this. Okay, after we run this, this is what we get. We get 6, 8, 10, 11. And so we can verify that math really quickly. 1 plus 5, 6. 6 plus 2, 8. 3 plus 7, 10. 10 plus 1, 11. And so this is correct. Now let's try another method where we read in the values of A and B rather than simply putting them in ourselves. Because the point of writing these programs is we want to write something that's adaptable to any situation. And so we're not always going to have the values at hand that we want to be adding. So being able to read them in is a lot more helpful. So let's import the scanner first. And let's set it up. Okay, well, then let's think about what we want to read in besides the values of A and B. Well, we're going to want to declare and initialize these first before we read anything in. And so to do that, thinking back on the syntax of declaring and initializing an array, we're going to need the size of them. So let's read that in and store it in an integer called n. Okay, now I can create A and B, and same with sum. Okay, after I know the sizes of arrays A and B, I'm going to want to read in their values. So to do that, I'm going to use a for loop. So remember how we can use a for loop to access every element in an array. So now when we're accessing that value of the array, we're going to assign a new value to it that we read in. So first for loop is going to take in the values of A. And then we can do the same thing for B. Okay, there we go. All right, so we are still going to create the array for the sum. And now our for loop here needs a little modification. We no longer know if the size is 4, so we're going to change that to n. Same thing with our very last for loop. All right, and there we go. We're done. Just a little bit of modification. All we had to do was just read in an integer n. And then what we did was first initialize A and B to the default values, and then we read in everything. After that, it was pretty much the same. We still did the same calculations, we still printed them out. Okay, now let's go ahead and run this. Before we do that, you can also add prompts. So enter the number of values in each array. And then in our first for loop, we can say enter a number. Same thing here. All right, that makes it a lot more clear. And before we print out the sum, we can also make it more clear and say their sum is and that's modified line 27, so we're printing everything out on the same line, separated by a space. All right, so now we're done. Okay, enter the number of values in each array. Let's go with 5. Okay, so now we're going to start reading in the values. All right, so before I press enter and it calculates everything, let's take a look at what our arrays are. So the first one, 6, 4, 1, 2, 3. The second one, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3. Okay, and so if we're calculating their sum, what we should get is 13, 12, 2, 4, 6. Okay, so now I'm going to press enter and see what I get. All right, so my output says their sum is 13, 12, 2, 4, 6. So this is correct. And we've managed to get our program to work. So great job so far. All right. So now we've covered arrays. Let's move on to something else called matrices. And so what a matrix is basically just a 2D array. You can think of an array as like a line, and a matrix is maybe a square or a rectangle or something like that. So unlike arrays with one row and n columns, we can say that matrices have m rows and n columns. And they are indexed by row and column, with rows from 0 to n minus 1 and columns from 0 to n minus 1. So let's take a look at this example matrix here. So as you can see, we have 3 rows and then 4 columns. So if I want to access maybe this element, I'm going to first indicate the row, which is 0, and then the column, which is 0. Now this diagram says 1 and 1. This is one index. Just subtract 1 from each of these. So this is still a 0, 0. Or maybe this element. As you can see, it's in row 2, so the correct index will be 1. And then it's in column 3, and the correct column index will be 2. So let's talk about creating matrices. Same thing, we still need to indicate the type. And then we're going to use double brackets here. It kind of shows that it's a 2D shape. Because remember, with an array, we just had one pair of brackets. That's kind of like 1D. One pair of braces, 1D. And then here, 2 pairs of braces, 2D. And then we give it an identifier. And then using the new keyword, we write the type again. And then in the first set of brackets, we give it m, the number of rows, and then n, the number of columns. So for instance, if I have a matrix of integers called square with 3 rows and 3 columns, it's going to look like this. And just like the arrays, we can also explicitly give the matrix values when we initialize it. So how we do that is we still have curly braces, but within the curly braces, you're going to have more sets of values. And so each sub pair of curly braces is 1 row. For instance, with my matrix square, this is still a 3 by 3 matrix. Why? You can tell there's 3 sets of sub curly braces. And then in each set of sub curly braces, there's 3 elements. That's the number of columns. So the first row will have 1, 2, 3. The second row will have 4, 5, 6. And the third row will have 7, 8, 9. So if we go ahead and take a look at the matrix now, you can see this is the first row at index 0. The second row at index 1, and then the third row at index 2. Then let's talk about accessing elements in a matrix, which we already pretty much covered. So we're just going to access it by its row and then column. Once again, you want to make sure that the row and column you're accessing are in range. So if I had square 2, row 2, and then column 2, this will give me the value 9 because it's in range. But if I want row 1, column 3, well, column 1 we have, but sorry, row 1 we have, but column 3 we don't. It's out here and it doesn't exist. So this is not valid. We're still going to get an error. So once again, be careful with your indices. Finally, iterating through matrices. So with a matrix, we know that every element has a row index from 0 to n minus 1, and then a column from 0 to n minus 1. So then we can use a nested for loop to iterate from position 0 to n minus 1 times the positions from 0 to n minus 1. So let's take a look at the syntax. in our outer for loop, this is going to tell us what's the current row we're on. And then our inner for loop is going to tell us which column we're currently on. So you'll notice something a bit different when I'm taking the conditions. So here for the outer for loop, I has to be less than the length of the array. But for the columns, I don't do the same thing. I say that J has to be less than the length of row 0 in the array. And so that may be a little confusing. So let's take a look at what that means, or what I'm trying to do. So let's pretend this is my matrix. And to be simple, let's say it's just 4 by 2. All right. So when I say the length of array 0, when array 0 accesses the row with index 0, right? So I'm taking this first row here, and then I'm taking its length. And its length, as you can see, is going to be 4, and that's the number of columns, right? Take a few seconds and kind of go over that, ponder it, see if it makes sense to you. It's a nifty little trick. All right. Now, here's an example with my square matrix. So as you can see here, the outer for loop, I is 0, I has to be less than the square's length. Then for the columns, j is 0, j is less than the length of the first row in the square. And then I'm going to print out the element at row I and column j in square, and I'm done. All right, so we've covered the basics of matrices, and now let's put it into practice. Here, we're going to do a similar thing as the exercise with arrays. Here, we're going to write a program that adds two matrices together and then prints out the resulting matrix. All right, so here, let's just start by asking for the dimensions of the matrices. So we're going to read in n, the number of columns, the number of rows, and then m, the number of columns. All right, so we're going to create two matrices, A and B. And the dimensions are going to be n by m. Same thing for B. Then I'm going to print out prompts as I read in my input. So first, enter the number of rows, then enter the number of columns. All right, so now I'm going to start reading in the values of A and B. So we can do the same thing, nested for loops, to access every element in each of these matrices and then assign a new value that we read into them. So let's start with A. In this case, we have the variables for the dimensions, so we don't need to use the array.length methods. So now the element at row I, and call them J and A, is going to be the next integer we read in. And same thing for B. All right, so now we've read in A and B. Let's create a sum matrix. All right, so now we're going to do the same thing, go through every single position, and then add the two numbers in A and B at that position and put it in sum. So yet another nested for loop. So sum row I, column J is going to be equal to these two numbers, right? Finally, we can print out the resulting sum. So the sum of these matrices is all right. So here I want to print out everything that's in row I on the same line, separated by a space. Okay. Now, after I'm finished printing everything out in the current row, I want to start on a new line, right? If I don't do that, everything in my output is going to be on one single line. I don't even know what my matrix is going to look like in the end. So here, as you can see, I didn't use the print with the new line method. This was all in one line. Here, I'm using print new line method. And there we go, we're done. So let's run this. Three rows, four columns. Okay, so now let's enter our matrices. So here's the first one. Let's go simple. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There's the first matrix. And then let's type the second one. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24. Okay. So if we add these, here's my first matrix. Here's my second matrix. Before I press the enter button, let's quickly calculate this. The resulting sum is gonna look like this. So 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, 24, 27, 30, 33, and 36. So that's what we'll expect. So now we have something to check against. And what do I get? The sum of these matrices is 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, 24, 27, 30, 33, 36. And that's exactly what we calculated. So yay, our program works. All right, so now we have covered arrays and matrices. And we are done with today's lesson. So thank you so much for listening, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!